Picture this: a world where every strike of a hammer could mean the difference between victory and defeat, where the glow of molten metal wasn't just a craft, but a lifeline for warriors marching into the unknown. Hidden in the shadows of history, there were workshops that didn't just make weapons, they forged the very tools that would shape the fate of empires. This is where the Crusaders, those legendary holy warriors, turned for the swords, shields, and armor that would carry them across battlefields and into the annals of time. But what made these workshops so extraordinary? How did they keep up with the relentless demand of war? And who were the master craftsmen behind these deadly creations? Step inside one of these ancient workshops, and you'd find more than just tools and fire. You'd discover a symphony of skill, tradition, and innovation. The air thick with the scent of burning coal, the rhythmic clang of metal meeting anvil, the murmur of artisans passing down secrets from one generation to the next. These weren't just factories, they were the beating heart of the Crusades, supplying not just weapons but hope to warriors who believed their cause was divine. The blacksmiths here didn't just shape steel, they shaped history itself, turning raw ore into instruments that would decide the rise and fall of kingdoms. But the true marvel lies in the details, the rare materials hauled from distant lands, the forgotten techniques that gave these weapons their legendary strength, the sheer scale of production needed to arm thousands. What made a Crusader's sword different from any other? How did these workshops manage to thrive even as war raged on? And why, centuries later, do their creations still captivate us? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on these hidden hubs of power, uncovering the stories of the craftsmen, the challenges they faced, and the legacy they left behind. This isn't just a tale of metal and fire, it's a story of human ingenuity, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit that fueled one of history's most epic chapters. So join us as we step into the shadows of the past, where every spark tells a story, and every weapon holds a secret waiting to be revealed. The Crusades didn't just ignite religious fervor, they sparked an arms race that stretched across continents. Picture the sheer logistics, tens of thousands of knights, foot soldiers, and mercenaries, all needing weapons that could withstand the brutal demands of war. This wasn't just about forging a few extra swords, it was about revolutionizing medieval warfare on an industrial scale. Workshops became the unsung heroes of the Crusades, transforming quiet villages and bustling cities into hubs of relentless production. Nobles and religious orders poured vast sums of money into these operations, knowing that without a steady supply of arms, their holy mission would crumble before it even reached distant shores. What made this era so remarkable was the unprecedented collaboration between craftsmen, traders, and patrons. Blacksmiths who once hammered out plowshares now turned their skills to crafting blades that could cleave through armor. Armorers experimented with new designs, reinforcing mail with steel plates to counter the deadly innovations of their enemies. And let's not forget the siege engineers, artisans who built colossal catapults and trebuchets, machines capable of reducing castle walls to rubble. The demand was so immense that workshops often operated day and night, their fires never cooling, their anvils never silent. Yet the true challenge wasn't just quantity, it was quality. A poorly made sword could shatter in battle, leaving a warrior defenseless. Armor with weak joints might as well be parchment against an opponent's strike. The best workshops became known for their meticulous standards, sourcing high-grade steel from as far away as Damascus or Toledo, metals famed for their strength and flexibility. These craftsmen didn't just meet the demands of war, they elevated the very art of weapon making, blending tradition with innovation to create arms that were as beautiful as they were deadly. Behind every sword, every shield was a story of human ingenuity. Take the crossbow, for example, a weapon so devastating it was once banned by the church. Crafting its intricate mechanisms required not just a blacksmith's strength but a clockmaker's precision. Or consider the humble spear, often dismissed as a simple tool, yet in the hands of a skilled workshop, its tip could be hardened to pierce even the toughest mail. These weren't just tools of war, they were masterpieces of engineering, each one a testament to the craftsmen who refused to cut corners, even when the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. The legacy of these workshops echoes far beyond the Crusades. Their innovations laid the groundwork for centuries of military technology, influencing everything from Renaissance armor to modern metallurgy. But perhaps their greatest achievement was proving that even in the darkest times, human creativity could shine, turning raw metal into instruments of both destruction and destiny. The master blacksmiths of the Crusades were far more than simple metalworkers. They were the unsung architects of medieval warfare, their hands shaping the tools that would carve history. Imagine spending a lifetime perfecting a single craft, where one misstep could mean the difference between a blade that saves lives or one that shatters in battle. These artisans didn't just learn their trade, they inherited centuries of accumulated wisdom, secrets guarded as closely as any royal treasure. From the moment a young apprentice first gripped a hammer, they embarked on a journey that could take decades to master, their skills refined through endless repetition and the watchful eyes of seasoned mentors. What set these craftsmen apart wasn't just their technical skill, but their intimate understanding of the soul of metal. They knew how to read the color of heated steel, recognizing the exact moment to plunge it into water or oil to achieve the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility. A technique as delicate as differential tempering, where the edge of a sword was hardened while the spine remained resilient, could turn an ordinary blade into a legendary weapon. And let's not forget pattern welding, where layers of iron and steel were painstakingly folded and twisted to create blades with mesmerizing grain patterns, each one as unique as a fingerprint. These methods weren't just for show, they produced swords capable of withstanding the chaos of battle, tools that warriors trusted with their lives. Yet the blacksmith's role extended far beyond the forge. They were chemists experimenting with alloys and carbon content to unlock new levels of durability. They were engineers designing weapons tailored to the evolving demands of warfare, whether it was a lighter sword for swift cavalry charges or a sturdier axe capable of crushing through armor. And perhaps most importantly, they were innovators, constantly adapting to the challenges of their time. When Crusaders encountered the superior steel of Damascus blades in the Middle East, it was these craftsmen who reverse-engineered their secrets, blending Eastern and Western techniques to push their craft into uncharted territory. The workshops themselves were temples of transformation, where raw materials became instruments of war. Picture the scene, the glow of the furnace casting long shadows, the rhythmic chorus of hammers striking anvils, the smell of burning charcoal and hot metal filling the air. Every weapon that emerged was a collaboration, with specialists handling each stage of production, from the smelter purifying ore to the grinder honing edges to razor sharpness. Even the humble nail-maker played a vital role, their ironwork holding together the shields and armor that protected armies. This wasn't just assembly line production, it was a symphony of precision where every note had to be perfect. What's often overlooked is the sheer pressure these artisans faced. A nobleman's order could mean the difference between a workshop thriving or starving, and deadlines were measured in lives, not days. A single flawed batch of arrowheads might doom an entire battalion. Yet despite these stakes, the best blacksmiths refused to compromise. Their reputations were built on reliability, and their marks, often stamped discreetly on a blade's tang, became symbols of trust. To wield a weapon bearing the sigil of a master smith was to carry a piece of their legacy into battle. The passing of these skills from one generation to the next was a sacred tradition. Apprenticeships weren't just about technical training. They were a rite of passage where young craftsmen absorbed the philosophy of their craft alongside its mechanics. A master might teach his pupil how to listen to the metal, to feel when it was ready to bend or when it needed rest. These lessons transcended mere technique. They were about patience, respect for materials, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. And though countless names have been lost to time, their influence endures in the weapons that survive, each one a silent testament to the hands that shaped them. In an age before mass production, these blacksmiths were the closest thing the medieval world had to industrial pioneers. Their workshops became centers of innovation, where the boundaries of technology were pushed with every strike of the hammer. They didn't just make weapons, they advanced the science of metallurgy itself, laying foundations that would eventually lead to the blast furnaces and factories of the modern era. Yet for all their ingenuity, their greatest legacy might be the reminder that behind every great historical movement, even one as vast as the Crusades, were individuals whose skill and dedication made the impossible possible. Walking into one of these workshops, you'd immediately notice how every inch of space served a purpose. No wasted movement, no idle tools. The heart of the operation was the forge, a roaring beast of fire and heat, its flames fed by massive bellows operated by apprentices or even water-powered mechanisms in more advanced setups. These weren't just random furnaces. Their temperatures were carefully controlled because the difference between a sword that bent or shattered and one that held firm could come down to a few degrees. Beside each forge stood the anvil, a solid block of iron where metal was hammered into shape, its surface worn smooth by countless strikes. The rhythmic clang of hammer meeting steel would have been constant, a soundtrack to the daily grind of production. But the real magic happened in the flow of the workspace. Raw materials entered at one end, often near the smelting area where ore was purified into workable metal. From there, the metal moved to the primary forging stations, where heavy hammers and skilled hands rough-shaped blades, axe heads, or armor plates. Nearby, smaller anvils and finer tools waited for detail work, tapering a sword's point, refining the curve of a helmet's visor, or chiseling intricate patterns into a knight's ceremonial dagger. Further along, quenching troughs filled with water or oil stood ready to cool and harden the freshly shaped metal in a dramatic hiss of steam. Each of these stations was positioned so a weapon could move seamlessly from one stage to the next, minimizing wasted time or effort. The tools themselves were extensions of the craftsman's hands. Tongs of various sizes gripped red-hot metal without slipping, their jaws worn from years of use. Hammers weren't just blunt instruments. They came in different weights and shapes, some for heavy forging, others for delicate adjustments. Chisels and punches added decorative etchings or functional details, like the grooves in a blade to lighten its weight without sacrificing strength. Even the grindstones, often turned by foot pedals or apprentices, had to be precisely angled to sharpen edges evenly. And let's not forget the measuring tools, iron calipers and templates ensured every weapon met exact specifications, because in battle, even a slight imbalance could be fatal. What's fascinating is how these workshops evolved over time. Early setups might have relied on a single forge and anvil, but as demand grew, so did the complexity. Larger operations resembled assembly lines with specialists stationed at each step. One group handled rough forging, another focused on finishing, while a third might specialize in hilts, scabbards, or armor fittings. In some workshops, you'd even find dedicated areas for testing blocks of wood or bundles of straw to check a blade's edge, or weighted dummies to ensure armor could absorb a crushing blow. Efficiency wasn't just about speed, it was about precision, consistency, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. The workshop was more than a workplace. It was a living ecosystem where every tool, every station, and every pair of hands played a critical role. And while the weapons they produced were destined for battle, the care and craftsmanship behind them spoke of something deeper, a relentless drive to create, to improve, and to leave a mark on history that would endure long after the fires of the forge had cooled. At the center of every workshop stood the forge, a pulsing, living entity that breathed fire into raw materials and will into craftsmanship. This wasn't just a fire pit, it was an alchemical furnace where ordinary iron shed its brittle nature and became something greater. Fed by carefully tended charcoal, the forge's flames could climb beyond 1,500 degrees, hot enough to make steel glow like captured sunlight, malleable as clay in a potter's hands. Master blacksmiths didn't merely stoke these fires, they conducted them, reading the dance of flames with the same precision a sailor reads the wind. Too little heat and the metal would resist shaping. Too much and it might burn away critical carbon content, weakening the very heart of a weapon. The forge's construction revealed medieval ingenuity at its finest. Built from heat-resistant stone and clay, its design funneled air through bellows sometimes operated by hand, other times by water wheels, to intensify the fire's core temperature. Positioned at waist height, it allowed smiths to work for hours without straining their backs, the ideal setup for the delicate ballet of heating and hammering. Surrounding the main firebox, smaller depressions called hearths held tools or secondary pieces at varying temperatures, letting craftsmen multitask with the efficiency of a modern production line. A well-designed forge wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of the blacksmith's own body, responding to subtle adjustments like a musical instrument to a virtuoso's touch. What truly set master smiths apart was their understanding of fire's language. They knew when to let metal soak in the heat, allowing temperature to penetrate deep into its crystalline structure. They recognized the significance of color shifts, from dull red to vibrant orange, then to pale yellow, each hue signaling a different state of readiness. For critical components like sword edges or armor joints, they might use a technique called packeting, burying the piece in charcoal to heat it slowly and evenly, avoiding stress fractures that could spell disaster in battle. This thermal wisdom wasn't written in books, it lived in the hands and eyes of those who spent lifetimes beside the flames. The forge's importance went beyond mere function, it was the workshop's spiritual core. New apprentices often began their training here, learning fire management before ever touching a hammer. The rhythmic wheeze of bellows became a meditative cadence, a backdrop to the transmission of centuries-old techniques. Even the charcoal itself held significance, sourced from specific woods like oak or hazel that burned cleaner and hotter, their selection a trade secret passed down through generations. When a forge fire was extinguished at day's end, the coals were carefully banked to preserve precious embers because restarting from cold could waste hours of precious daylight. Maintenance of this fiery heart was constant and ritualistic. Ashes had to be cleared daily to prevent airflow blockage. The clay lining required regular patching with special refractory mixtures that could withstand repeated thermal shocks. Tools left too long in the fire might sacrifice themselves to the flames, their metal dissolving into the forge's ever-hungry maw. Yet despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, the forge commanded reverence. Its light painted the workshop walls with shifting shadows, transforming mundane labor into something almost sacred. To stand before an active medieval forge wasn't just to witness metalworking, it was to observe the very transformation of matter, the point where human skill harnessed elemental power to shape history's course. The legacy of these forges echoes in unexpected places today. Modern metallurgists still study medieval temperature control methods, marveling at how these artisans achieved such consistency without thermometers or pyrometers. Some traditional bladesmiths continue to use forges nearly identical to those from Crusader workshops, proving the timelessness of good design. And perhaps most tellingly, when archaeologists uncover ancient workshop sites, the forge area always yields the most artifacts, not just tools and weapons, but personal items dropped in the heat of work, silent witnesses to the human hands that once coaxed miracles from fire and metal. The quest for quality metal was a never-ending struggle for Crusader workshops because not all iron was created equal. Ordinary bog iron, the kind scraped from marshes and shallow mines, might suffice for farm tools, but warriors needed something far stronger. The difference between victory and defeat could hinge on the purity of a sword's steel, the resilience of a helmet's rim. Workshops scoured the known world for the finest materials, forging trade networks as vast as the Crusades themselves. Some sourced iron from the frosty mines of Scandinavia, where ore veins ran deep and pure. Others bartered for steel ingots from Spain's Toledo region, a place already legendary for blades that could slice through silk as easily as flesh. But the most coveted material of all was crucible steel, a near-mythical metal from distant lands like India and Persia, its crystalline structure yielding edges so sharp they seemed to defy physics. Securing these materials wasn't just about wealth, it demanded diplomacy, ingenuity, and sometimes sheer audacity. Imagine the logistics of transporting tons of ore or ingots across treacherous routes, through bandit-plagued forests and pirate-haunted seas. Some workshops formed alliances with merchant guilds, offering exclusive contracts in exchange for priority access to fresh shipments. Others turned to recycling on an industrial scale, melting down captured weapons, broken armor, even old nails, anything that could be reforged into something new. Battlefields became inadvertent supply depots, with scavengers stripping fallen soldiers of their gear to be hauled back to the workshop fires. The real alchemy, though, happened in the refining process. Raw iron ore was often riddled with impurities, sulfur, phosphorus, silica, that could turn a sword brittle as glass. Skilled smelters developed intricate methods to purge these flaws, sometimes mixing in charcoal during heating to infuse the metal with life-giving carbon. The best workshops employed bloomery furnaces, where ore was heated just shy of melting, allowing impurities to drip away while leaving behind a spongy mass of wrought iron. This bloom would then be hammered, folded, and rehammered, dozens, even hundreds of times, to homogenize its structure. The result was a material both tough and flexible, capable of absorbing the shock of combat without shattering. Crucible steel was in a league of its own. Unlike European methods, which relied on mechanical folding, this Middle Eastern marvel was made by sealing iron and carbon in clay vessels and heating them for days until the metal liquefied. The slow cooling process allowed carbon to distribute evenly, creating a microstructure of microscopic bands that gave the steel its legendary properties. Damascus blades forged from this very material became the stuff of Crusader nightmares, their wavy patterns hiding edges that could allegedly split a hair lengthwise. Workshops lucky enough to obtain even small amounts treated it like gold, reserving it for elite clients or critical weapon components, but scarcity bred innovation. When imports faltered, whether from war, embargo, or simple distance, blacksmiths learned to mimic premium steels through clever techniques. Pattern welding, for instance, layered hard high-carbon steel between softer iron cores, creating a composite blade with the best traits of both. Some even experimented with surface treatments, packing finished weapons in animal bones or leather during quenching to infuse the outer layer with extra carbon. These weren't perfect substitutes, but they kept workshops running when ideal materials were out of reach. The true test came in battle. A sword made from inferior metal might develop deadly stress cracks after a few clashes. Armor could dent or puncture where quality steel would deflect a blow. Warriors quickly learned which workshops could be trusted, and word spread fast. A blacksmith's reputation, and by extension, his livelihood, rested on the invisible qualities of the metals he used. That's why the greatest workshops didn't just make weapons. They mastered the entire chain of supply, from mine to market, ensuring that every piece of steel they touched carried the unspoken promise of survival. In the end, these materials did more than shape weapons, they shaped history. The struggle to secure quality metal drove technological leaps, spurred global trade, and even influenced the outcomes of battles. Behind every Crusaders' victory lay an untold story of mined ore, smelted ingots, and the relentless pursuit of perfection in a world where metal was destiny. Transforming raw earth into a warrior's blade was an act of patience and precision, a dance between fire and force that could stretch across weeks. It began deep underground, where miners extracted iron ore, rust-colored rock flecked with metallic promise. This unassuming stone would undergo a metamorphosis, first in the smelting furnace, where temperatures soared high enough to separate metal from waste. The ore was layered with charcoal in a clay-lined pit, the burning carbon not only fueling the fire but also seeping into the iron, beginning its transformation into steel. As the mixture melted, impurities dripped away like sweat, leaving behind a glowing, porous mass called a bloom, the rough draft of a future sword. This bloom was far from battle-ready. Blacksmiths reheated it and hammered it relentlessly, folding the metal over itself like a baker kneading dough. Each fold welded layers together, driving out lingering imperfections while distributing carbon evenly, a crucial step, since uneven carbon meant weak spots that could shatter under stress. Some master smiths folded their steel hundreds of times, creating intricate grain patterns that resembled flowing water or swirling wood. The process wasn't just about strength, it was artistry in motion, a hidden beauty only revealed when the finished blade was polished to a mirror shine. Once purified, the steel entered its most critical phase, shaping the soul of the sword. The smith heated the metal to a malleable glow, then hammered it against the anvil with measured blows, gradually drawing out the blade's profile. A skilled craftsman could eyeball the tapering width and thickness, ensuring the sword balanced like an extension of the wielder's arm. The tip demanded particular care: too thick and it wouldn't pierce, too thin and it might snap. Meanwhile, the spine needed resilience to absorb blows, while the edge required hardness to hold a razor's sharpness. This duality was the sword's paradox. It had to be unyielding yet flexible, brutal yet precise. Tempering was where science and intuition collided. After shaping, the blade was heated once more, then plunged into water or oil, a dramatic moment where steam exploded like a dragon's breath. This rapid cooling locked the steel's crystalline structure into extreme hardness, but also brittleness. So the smith gently reheated the blade, just enough to soften it slightly, creating a perfect marriage of toughness and edge retention. Some masters even used differential tempering, coating the spine in clay before quenching to slow its cooling, resulting in a blade with a hard edge and a shock-absorbing back, a technique that made Crusader swords legendary for their durability. The final steps were a symphony of specialists. Grinders honed the edge with rotating stones, their hands steady as they carved a bevel sharp enough to split silk midair. Polishers rubbed the blade with progressively finer abrasives, from rough sandstone to leather strops laden with crushed quartz, until it reflected the smith's face like still water. Meanwhile, other craftsmen fashioned the hilt-carving grip scales from dense wood or bone, wrapping them in leather for sweat-proof traction, and mounting a crossguard to protect the wielder's hand. Every component had to harmonize. A poorly balanced hilt could turn a swift strike into a clumsy stumble, while ill-fitted tangs, the blade's hidden root inside the hilt, risked catastrophic failure mid-swing. What's astonishing is how much craftsmanship was invisible. A sword's tang, buried within the hilt, was often left rough to grip the handle materials securely, a hidden touch of pragmatism beneath the visible elegance. Many blades bore subtle distal taper, thinning gradually from base to tip to distribute weight perfectly. Even the curvature of Crusader arming swords wasn't arbitrary. It optimized slashing efficiency while allowing quick recovery for the next strike. These nuances weren't accidents. They were the accumulated wisdom of generations, refined through trial, error, and the life or death feedback of battle. The true test came not in the workshop, but in the hands of warriors. A well-made sword didn't just feel light, it felt alive, responding to the wielder's intentions with barely a thought. In the chaos of combat, where milliseconds meant survival, this synergy between craftsman and warrior was the ultimate validation. And though centuries have passed, holding one of these blades today still sends a shiver down the spine, not just for its deadly potential, but for the untold hours of sweat, fire, and genius forged into every inch of steel. While swords captured the imagination, armor was the unsung hero that kept Crusaders alive on the battlefield. Picture a knight charging into combat. His survival depended not just on the weapon in his hand, but the layers of protection crafted with equal care in the workshop. Shields were the first line of defense, often made from layered wood, oak, linden, or birch, covered in tough leather or even reinforced with metal rims. These weren't just passive barriers. Their curved designs could deflect arrows, while the central iron boss turned them into offensive tools, capable of stunning an opponent with a well-placed bash. Helmets evolved dramatically during the Crusades, starting as simple nasal guards and blossoming into the great helms that became iconic. Forging one was a feat of geometry and metallurgy. A single sheet of steel was heated and hammered into a conical shape, distributing the force of blows away from the wearer's skull. Vision slits were carefully measured too narrow, and the knight would fight half blind, too wide, and they'd become fatal weak points. The interior was lined with padded arming caps, a crucial detail often overlooked because even the finest metal could turn into an oven under the Middle Eastern sun, or transmit bone-jarring shocks without proper cushioning. But the true masterpiece of medieval protection was chainmail. A single suit contained up to 20,000 individually crafted rings, each one punched from sheet metal or drawn into wire, then coiled, cut, and interlocked with 4 others in an unbreakable pattern. The process was so meticulous that workshops often divided labor. Some artisans specialized in ring making, others in weaving the mail into shirts, coifs, or leggings. Riveted rings, where each tiny circle was fastened with a microscopic metal peg, offered superior strength but demanded inhuman patience. A single hauberk could consume 6 months of work, the metallic equivalent of weaving a tapestry from steel thread. What's astonishing is how these craftsmen balanced protection with practicality. Chainmail moved like fabric, allowing warriors to mount horses or swing swords freely. Helmets were designed to channel rainwater away from the face, while shield straps could be adjusted mid-battle if a hand was injured. Every design choice reflected real battlefield feedback, a dialogue between smiths and soldiers that spanned generations. And though these workshops couldn't know it, Their innovations were laying the groundwork for the articulated plate armor that would dominate later centuries, proving once again that necessity wasn't just the mother of invention, it was the forge that shaped history. When the walls of a fortress loomed impenetrable, it was the siege weapons from these workshops that turned the tide of war. Imagine the sight of a trebuchet, a towering beast of wood and iron, capable of hurling stones the weight of a horse hundreds of meters through the air. These weren't just oversized catapults, they were feats of medieval engineering, combining brute force with mathematical precision. The workshop's blacksmiths forged the heavy counterweights and iron reinforcements, while carpenters shaped the massive timber frames, each joint carved to bear unimaginable stress. Engineers calculated trajectories, adjusting sling lengths and pivot points to ensure every shot struck with devastating accuracy. The construction of such a machine could take weeks, requiring not just skill but an almost artistic understanding of balance, tension, and destruction. Battering rams were no less sophisticated. Far from the simple logs depicted in stories, these were complex machines, some mounted on wheeled frames, others protected by roofs called penthouses to shield operators from arrows and boiling oil. The workshop's ironworkers crafted the ram's head, often shaped like a snarling beast or spiked like a monstrous mace, designed to splinter gates or weaken stone through relentless impact. Every component had to withstand forces that would shatter lesser tools, demanding materials of the highest quality and craftsmanship. The difference between a ram that crumpled on first strike and one that could pound for hours lay in the workshop's ability to marry wood's flexibility with metal's unyielding strength. What made these siege engines truly remarkable was their adaptability. Workshops produced portable versions for rapid deployment, collapsible trebuchets that could be assembled on site, or modular rams transported in pieces to avoid detection. Some engines were even customized for specific sieges, shorter arms for tight spaces, or specialized projectiles like fire pots or diseased carcasses to spread terror behind enemy walls. The creativity of these craftsmen knew no bounds. When standard approaches failed, they innovated on the fly, turning everyday materials into instruments of psychological and physical domination. Yet the real challenge wasn't just building these monsters, it was maintaining them under siege conditions. Blacksmiths traveled with armies, their mobile forges repairing bent metal under the glow of torchlight. Carpenters replaced shattered beams mid-battle, often under a rain of arrows. These artisans worked in the shadow of death, knowing that if their creations faltered, the entire campaign might collapse. Their names rarely made it into chronicles, but without them, even the bravest knights would have been powerless against towering castle walls. The legacy of these siege workshops echoes in modern engineering principles. Their understanding of leverage, material stress, and kinetic energy laid groundwork for everything from cranes to demolition equipment. But perhaps their greatest lesson was in collaboration, proof that when blacksmiths, carpenters, and thinkers combined their talents, they could reshape the world, one massive stone or splintered gate at a time. Every weapon that emerged from a Crusader workshop carried more than just sharp edges, it bore the weight of a life or death promise. Testing wasn't a formality. It was a sacred ritual, the final barrier between craftsmanship and catastrophe. Picture a master smith gripping a freshly forged sword, its blade glinting in the firelight as he raised it high, not to admire his work, but to slam it down onto a solid oak block with enough force to make the workshop walls shudder. This wasn't brutality, it was necessity. A single microscopic flaw, invisible to the eye, could spiderweb into a fatal break when a knight needed it most. The true test wasn't whether the blade survived, it was whether it survived unscathed, without so much as a nick to betray weakness. Armor endured trials just as punishing. A helmet might be strapped to a wooden post and struck repeatedly with a mace, each blow calibrated to mimic the fury of battlefield combat. Chainmail shirts were draped over clay forms and pierced with arrows or spears, the smiths watching closely to see if rings popped or metal yielded too easily. Shields faced a gauntlet of axes and swords, their surfaces inspected after each strike for cracks or splits that could spell disaster. These weren't gentle quality checks, they were simulations of the chaos awaiting beyond the workshop doors. But the most revealing test was often the simplest: balance. A well-made sword didn't just withstand blows, it moved like an extension of the warrior's body. Smiths would pass weapons to experienced fighters, watching how the blade flowed through cuts and parries. Did it feel alive in the hand, or did it drag like dead weight? Was the weight distributed so a tired knight could swing it for hours without exhaustion? Even the finest steel failed. It betrayed its wielder's instincts in the heat of combat. The marks left by these trials became badges of honor. A blade that passed might receive the smith's personal stamp near the hilt, a tiny symbol of trust etched into the tang where only the grip would hide it. Armor that deflected every test blow was sometimes adorned with subtle engravings, not for decoration but as silent testimony to its resilience. These weren't just weapons, they were lifelines, and the craftsmen who made them treated each one as if their own lives depended on its performance. What's remarkable is how scientific these methods were. Centuries before modern metallurgy, smiths understood concepts like stress distribution and material fatigue intuitively, developing tests that mirrored the brutal realities of war. A sword might be flexed repeatedly to check for metal fatigue, or heated and cooled in cycles to ensure it wouldn't fail in desert heat or winter frost. Armor joints were articulated hundreds of times to guarantee they wouldn't stiffen when blood and mud clogged them. Every test answered a single unspoken question: would this weapon be worthy of the crusader who carried it into the unknown? The stakes couldn't have been higher. In an era before standardized production, a workshop's reputation and the lives of its patrons rested on these final moments of scrutiny. A single flawed blade slipping through could tarnish a smith's name forever, but those that passed, they became legends carried into battles that shaped kingdoms, their edges sharpened not just by whetstones but by the relentless pursuit of perfection. The workshop's heartbeat wasn't just the clang of hammers, it pulsed through the carefully structured ranks of its craftsmen, each tier a stepping stone in a lifelong journey of mastery. At the base stood the apprentices, wide-eyed boys as young as 12 who began by sweeping floors and feeding bellows. Their hands, still soft with youth, learned the rhythms of the forge through menial tasks, sorting nails, bundling charcoal, or holding lengths of hot metal steady while a senior smith hammered. These weren't just chores, they were the first lessons in patience and discipline. An apprentice might spend months simply observing before ever touching a hammer, absorbing the workshop's tempo like a language. Mistakes were met not with anger, but with correction. A misshapen nail became a chance to demonstrate proper heat control, a botched weld an opportunity to explain airflow's importance. Graduation to journeyman status was a hard-won milestone, often taking 7 years or more. These were the workshop's workhorses, skilled enough to shape sword blades or rivet mail rings without supervision, yet still refining their artistry. Unlike apprentices, journeymen received wages meager, but enough to mark their transition into true craftsmen. Their days were a symphony of varied tasks, 1 hour spent forging spearheads, the next repairing a knight's dented breastplate, all under the watchful eye of the master. Some workshops even sent journeymen on wander years, traveling to other cities to learn regional techniques. This cross-pollination of skills was the medieval equivalent of higher education, turning competent smiths into versatile innovators. At the pyramid's peak sat the master, a title earned through decades of devotion. Becoming one required more than technical skill. It demanded business acumen, teaching ability, and sometimes even a masterpiece judged by existing masters. A master's workshop was his kingdom, where he balanced orders from nobility with the steady training of new generations. His hands touched only the most critical work, tempering a lord's sword, fitting a helmet's visor, or troubleshooting a siege engine's flawed mechanism. But his true legacy lay in mentorship. A master knew each apprentice's strengths, assigning tasks to nurture their talents. One might show promise in delicate engraving, another in the brute force needed for armor plating. This hierarchy wasn't just about maintaining order, it was a living library of technique. Apprentices preserved foundational skills that journeymen refined, while masters pushed boundaries with innovations that trickled down through the ranks. The system's genius lay in its continuity. When a master passed, his journeymen could seamlessly elevate, ensuring no knowledge was lost. Even rival workshops respected this structure, recognizing that a master's stamp on a blade represented not just individual skill, but centuries of accumulated wisdom passed hand to hand, generation to generation. What's often overlooked is how fluid this system could be. A gifted apprentice might advance faster, while a journeyman with leadership qualities could be groomed to take over a workshop. Women, though rarely mentioned in records, sometimes inherited shops from fathers or husbands, proving competence trumped tradition when survival was at stake. And in moments of crisis, a sudden siege or nobleman's urgent order, the hierarchy flexed. Apprentices manned bellows through the night, journeymen tackled tasks above their rank, and masters worked alongside everyone, their authority measured not by distance but by willingness to sweat alongside their team. The echoes of this system still resonate today. Modern trades from carpentry to surgical training mirror its phased learning, proving some truths transcend time. But perhaps its most enduring lesson was the value it placed on growth, not just in metal, but in the people who shaped it. Every master had once been an apprentice shivering by the forge door. Every journeyman carried the spark of future greatness. In a world where most lives were bound by birthright, the workshop hierarchy offered something rare, a path where skill, not bloodline, determined one's destiny. In the world of Crusader workshops, knowledge wasn't just power, it was currency guarded more fiercely than any chest of gold. Master smiths treated their techniques like state secrets, whispering them only to chosen successors after years of testing loyalty. Some methods were so closely held that entire lineages of blacksmiths could be identified by the subtle quirks in their blades, a distinctive ripple pattern in the steel, or a peculiar curve near the tip that made their swords slice through armor like parchment. These weren't mere stylistic choices, they were the culmination of generations of trial and error, refined until they bordered on alchemy. Take the mystery of Damascus steel, a material so coveted that workshops would go to absurd lengths to protect its secrets. Some smiths deliberately obscured their process, staging fake arguments or misleading demonstrations to throw off spies. Others encoded their recipes in cryptic rhymes, passed down orally to avoid written records falling into rival hands. One legendary technique involved quenching blades in specially prepared liquids. Some whispered of donkey urine or magical oils, but the truth was often simpler. A precise mix of salts and oils that cooled the metal at just the right rate to create unmatched hardness without brittleness. The exact formula, known only to a handful of masters, each sworn to silence, the guild system institutionalized this secrecy. In cities like Cologne or Milan, blacksmiths formed tight-knit brotherhoods with strict rules, share nothing with outsiders, under penalty of fines or even expulsion. Apprentices learned through imitation and repetition, not explanation. A master might demonstrate a technique 100 times before allowing his pupil to attempt it. Even tools were customized to individual workshops. A hammer's weight or anvil's shape could be subtly altered to produce unique results recognizable only to insiders. This culture of secrecy wasn't paranoia, it was survival. In an era where a single superior sword design could win or lose a war, knowledge truly was power. Yet within these closed circles, innovation flourished. Some workshops pioneered laminated blades, sandwiching hard high-carbon steel between softer iron layers to combine flexibility with deadly edges. Others experimented with differential hardening, using clay coatings to create swords with razor-sharp edges and shock-absorbing spines, a technique later immortalized in Japanese katana making. The most brilliant smiths even manipulated metal at a molecular level, though they'd never phrase it that way. By carefully controlling the forge's temperature and the timing of each hammer blow, they could align steel's crystalline structure like microscopic armor, creating weapons that seemed almost supernatural in their resilience. The cost of losing these secrets could be catastrophic. When the Crusaders captured Damascus in 1148, they found abandoned forges with half-finished blades, but no masters to explain their methods. Similarly, the decline of Viking sword-making coincided with the deaths of a few key artisans, their knowledge vanishing before it could be fully passed on. This fragility forced workshops to walk a razor's edge, hoard techniques too tightly and risk extinction, share too freely and lose their competitive edge. The smartest masters kept written records but stored them in cipher, or buried them in monastery libraries where only trusted allies could access them. What's fascinating is how these secrets transcended mere utility. Some techniques became rituals, performed with ceremonial precision, even when their original purpose was forgotten. A smith might always quench blades at dawn, not because light affected the metal, but because his grandfather swore it captured the morning's purity in the steel. Others whispered prayers over molten metal, less from superstition than from muscle memory, a nod to some long-dead mentor's habits. These traditions weren't just nostalgia, they were the living thread connecting centuries of craftsmanship. The legacy of this secrecy still echoes today. Modern metallurgists spend years reverse engineering medieval weapons, using electron microscopes to decode what masters understood by instinct. Some techniques, once thought lost, are being rediscovered through archaeology and experimentation. Yet even now, there are gaps, tiny details in the dance of fire and iron that may never be fully recovered. Because the greatest trade secret of all wasn't just the how, it was the why, the accumulated wisdom of generations who knew that true mastery wasn't in the hands alone, but in the unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back to the first smith who dared shape metal into destiny. The most successful workshops weren't just skilled, they were strategically brilliant, positioning themselves like chess pieces in the grand game of medieval warfare. Picture a bustling forge nestled just beyond the walls of a Crusader castle, close enough to hear the distant clash of battle, yet far enough to avoid sudden raids. These workshops thrived in the shadow of conflict, their locations carefully chosen to balance safety with swift delivery. Proximity to the front lines meant weapons could reach warriors in days, not weeks, a critical advantage when a single battle could turn the tide of an entire campaign. Some even sprang up along well-trodden supply routes, transforming remote way stations into hubs of industry where caravans paused not just for food and rest, but for fresh arrows, repaired armor, and reforged blades. But the real genius lay in adaptability. When Crusader armies pushed deeper into enemy territory, certain workshops packed up their entire operation, anvils, bellows, and all loading them onto ox carts to follow the troops. These mobile units were the medieval equivalent of field hospitals, patching up damaged gear under makeshift tents while the battle still raged nearby. Imagine the scene, smiths hammering out dents in a knight's breastplate by firelight, mere miles from where that same armor would be tested again at dawn. The logistical challenges were staggering, securing steady charcoal supplies in foreign lands, finding local water sources for quenching, even bartering with nearby villages for scrap metal. Yet these roving craftsmen made it work through sheer ingenuity. Geography played a hidden role in workshop success. Coastal cities like Acre and Tyre became arms production powerhouses, their ports welcoming shiploads of raw materials from Europe while dispatching finished weapons to inland strongholds. Mountain settlements near iron-rich mines could skip the risky import process altogether, though they risked isolation if siege cut off mountain passes. River towns had dual advantages: water wheels to power massive trip hammers for forging, and natural highways to float heavy shipments downstream to waiting armies. Even the landscape's natural defenses mattered. A workshop tucked into a valley might escape notice, while one on an open plain could be plundered before its products ever reached the front. What's fascinating is how these locations left lasting marks. Archaeologists can trace Crusader troop movements by following the debris trails of abandoned workshops, piles of slag, fragments of shattered molds, even the occasional half-finished arrowhead dropped in haste. Some sites show evidence of sudden abandonment, with tools left mid-task as craftsmen fled invaders. Others reveal layers of rebuilding, proof that certain spots were too valuable to abandon completely. The best locations became permanent fixtures, evolving into the armories of later centuries, silent testimony to how a well-placed workshop didn't just serve a war, but could shape the land itself long after the fighting ended. The true measure of their strategic brilliance, even enemies recognized it. Saladin's forces made deliberate efforts to capture or destroy Crusader workshops, knowing these hubs were as vital as any fortress. Some Islamic commanders even relocated captured Christian smiths to their own cities, blending European metalworking techniques with Eastern designs. In the end, the workshops that survived longest weren't necessarily the most skilled. They were the ones who understood that in warfare, location isn't just about geography. It's about being exactly where history needs you when it needs you most. The staggering cost of running these workshops could bankrupt a small kingdom, yet somehow they thrived for decades. Behind every glowing forge and stack of finished swords stood a web of powerful patrons, each investing in the hope of victory. Noble families were among the most prolific backers, treating workshops like modern venture capitalists fund tech startups. A single baron might bankroll an entire armory, not out of charity, but in exchange for first claim on its output. Contracts were drawn up with meticulous detail. So many swords per month, so many helmets by winter's end, with penalties for missed deadlines that could strip a blacksmith of his tools or even his freedom. For the nobility, this wasn't just business, it was survival. A well-armed retinue meant power, and power meant everything in the cutthroat world of medieval politics. Wealthy merchants played an equally vital role, though their motives were often more pragmatic. Trade guilds in cities like Venice and Genoa saw the Crusades not as holy wars, but as lucrative opportunities. They financed workshops with the same shrewdness they applied to spice caravans or silk routes, demanding exclusivity deals that locked Crusader states into long-term supply agreements. Some even pioneered early forms of arms trafficking, buying surplus weapons from one conflict zone to resell at inflated prices in another. Their ledgers tell the tale, pages filled with entries for 500 lance heads shipped to Acre or 20 dozen crossbow bolts, payment deferred until safe delivery. For these entrepreneurs, war was less about ideology than supply and demand. Then there was the church, perhaps the most influential patron of all. Monasteries with vast landholdings often housed smithies on their premises, turning pious donations into instruments of holy war. The Knights Templar took this a step further, operating their own clandestine workshops across the Holy Land, their blacksmiths working under vows of secrecy. Ecclesiastical funding came with strings-attached weapons were sometimes inscribed with crosses or biblical verses, transforming tools of war into sacred objects. A sword blessed by a bishop carried more than steel. It carried divine sanction, making its wielder both soldier and pilgrim in one. The financial ecosystem surrounding these workshops was surprisingly sophisticated. Some operated on credit, with Italian bankers advancing funds against future production. Others bartered, exchanging weapons for tax exemptions, land grants, or even noble titles. A few enterprising masters developed subscription models, where patrons paid annual fees for priority access to new shipments. The risk was enormous. A workshop that failed to deliver could face ruin, while a backer whose investment didn't yield enough arms might find his army outmatched on the battlefield. What's often overlooked is how these financial networks transcended borders. Jewish moneylenders in Cairo financed workshops supplying Saladin's forces, while Byzantine gold flowed to Armenian smiths making weapons for Christian allies. The flow of capital mirrored the flow of conflict, with money changing hands across enemy lines through neutral intermediaries. In war, it seemed, even rivals recognized one universal truth: quality weapons required deep pockets, and no cause, holy or otherwise, could survive without them. The legacy of this patronage lingers in unexpected places. Modern military-industrial complexes owe more to these medieval arrangements than we might think. The same interplay of need, greed, and ideology that fueled Crusader workshops now drives defense contracts worth billions. Back then, as now, the lesson was clear. Wars aren't just won on battlefields. They're won in the quiet negotiations between those who wield swords and those who make them possible. Guilds transformed the chaotic world of medieval weapon making into a finely tuned system, part trade union, part quality control board, and part court of law. These organizations didn't just oversee blacksmiths, they elevated the entire craft, turning individual workshops into nodes in a vast network of regulated excellence. Imagine a young smith in 14th century Cologne, hammer in hand, dreaming of opening his own shop. Before he could strike a single blade, he'd need guild approval, a process as rigorous as any knighthood's vigil. Masters would inspect his technique, test his knowledge of metallurgy, even scrutinize the moral character references from his mentors. Only then would he earn the right to stamp his work with the guild seal, a symbol that told customers this weapon wouldn't fail them when lives hung in the balance. Quality standards were the guild's crowning achievement. They established precise formulas: so much carbon content for sword edges, specific thickness for helmet visors, that made Crusader weapons remarkably consistent across kingdoms. In Paris, guild statutes dictated exactly how many layers a properly folded blade required, while Milanese regulations specified the alloy mix for armor rings. These weren't suggestions, they were enforceable rules with fines or even expulsion for repeat offenders. Guild wardens conducted surprise workshop inspections, examining half-finished weapons with the scrutiny of modern FDA agents. A sword that bent too easily or a helmet that dented under test blows could land its maker in front of a guild tribunal faster than you could say, temper failure. But guilds did more than police quality. They were medieval HR departments and arbitrators rolled into one. When two smiths clashed over a stolen client or disputed payment, guild elders mediated with the wisdom of Solomon. They set fair wage scales to prevent cutthroat underbidding that might compromise craftsmanship. Some even maintained emergency funds for injured members or widows, ensuring no guildsman's family starved if tragedy struck at the anvil. This safety net encouraged risk-taking. A smith could experiment with a new quenching technique, knowing his basic survival didn't hinge solely on each day's output. Their influence extended far beyond workshop walls. Guilds negotiated bulk charcoal prices for entire cities, securing discounts individual craftsmen could never obtain. They lobbied kings for favorable trade policies like reduced tariffs on imported steel. In times of war, they coordinated production across regions, ensuring armor shipments reached frontline troops without 10 different workshops duplicating efforts. The Venetian Arms Guild even ran its own intelligence network, gathering reports on Ottoman weapon innovations that might require counter-designs. Yet guilds weren't without controversy. Their strict apprenticeship rules, sometimes limiting new members to relatives of existing masters, could stifle fresh talent. Some became so powerful they manipulated markets, artificially inflating sword prices during conflicts. And their resistance to certain innovations, like early gunpowder weapons, occasionally left Crusader forces lagging behind enemies with less tradition-bound armories. The true testament to their success lies in the artifacts that survived them. Examine a guild-stamped 14th century longsword beside one from 200 years earlier, and the difference is stark, not just in quality, but in the quiet confidence of craftsmanship. That consistency didn't happen by accident. It was the product of generations of guildmasters arguing, experimenting, and codifying exactly what made steel worthy of a warrior's hand. When a knight strapped on his guild-certified armor, he wasn't just wearing metal, he was wearing centuries of institutional knowledge, forged not in fire, but in the collective wisdom of those who refused to let mediocrity become the standard. History often paints medieval workshops as exclusively male domains, where burly blacksmiths and armorers dominated the craft. But look closer, and you'll find the fingerprints of women woven into every stage of production, hidden in plain sight, yet vital to the workshop's heartbeat. While guild records might list only men's names, account books and household inventories tell a different story. Women weren't just bystanders. They were the unseen backbone of the arms trade, their labor as essential as the forge's fire. Take chainmail, for example, a painstaking craft requiring thousands of interlocking rings. While men might forge and cut the metal, it was often women and children who meticulously linked them together, their nimble fingers working for hours to weave steel into protective garments. This wasn't just busy work. A single hauberk could demand over 20,000 rings, each needing precise alignment. Without these skilled hands, armies would have waited months longer for critical armor. Similarly, blade polishing, a task dismissed as lesser work, was anything but trivial. A poorly polished sword might corrode prematurely or develop hidden stress fractures, while a perfectly honed edge could mean the difference between a glancing blow and a lethal strike. Women's expertise in finishing touches often determined whether a weapon lived up to its potential. Some women didn't just participate, they led. When husbands or fathers marched off to war, widows and daughters frequently took over workshop operations, keeping production alive despite shortages of materials or labor. The famed Armorers Guild of Milan even had provisions for mistress smiths, though these exceptions were rarely documented. In smaller villages, women managed entire supply chains, bartering with charcoal burners for fuel or negotiating with merchants for raw iron. Their administrative skills kept workshops solvent when traditional structures faltered. The most striking evidence of women's roles lies in the artifacts themselves. Archaeologists have found graves of high-status women buried with tools typically associated with metalworking, not as symbolic offerings, but as well-worn implements bearing marks of years of use. In York, England, a skeleton identified as a woman was discovered surrounded by sword-making equipment, her hands still bearing the telltale muscular development of a lifelong smith. These finds shatter the myth that women only handled soft tasks, proving some worked the forge with the same skill as their male counterparts. What's tragic is how their contributions were systematically erased. Guilds often barred women from formal apprenticeships, forcing them to learn through informal family networks. A master's daughter might master every technique but never earn an official title, her work attributed to a brother or husband. Even when women excelled, their innovations were absorbed into the workshop's collective output, stripped of individual credit. The few exceptions, like the legendary Sabina von Steinfurt, who reportedly ran a thriving armory in 12th century Germany, stand as reminders of how many stories were lost. Yet their legacy lingers in subtle ways. The delicate floral engravings on certain Crusader daggers. Historians now attribute many to female artisans, whose artistic sensibilities blended beauty with lethality. The distinctive flexibility of some chainmail, likely influenced by women's insights into how armor needed to move with the body, not against it. Even the ergonomic designs of later sword hilts, which accommodated smaller hands, may reflect the feedback of women who tested weapons for balance and grip. The workshop wasn't just a place of fire and iron, it was a tapestry of collaboration where every pair of hands, regardless of gender, contributed to something greater. And while history's ledger might overlook them, the weapons they helped create carried their silent influence onto battlefields and into the pages of time. Their story isn't just about reclaiming credit, it's about understanding how medieval workshops truly functioned not as monolithic male enterprises, but as complex ecosystems where skill mattered more than stereotypes. The glow of the forge wasn't the only light that filled these workshops. There was another kind of fire, one that burned with faith. For many Crusader weapon makers, their craft wasn't just a trade, it was a sacred calling. Monasteries and religious orders often operated their own smithies, where the rhythmic clang of hammers blended with the chanting of prayers. Before a single sword left these holy workshops, it might be laid across an altar, blessed by a priest who invoked divine protection for the warrior who would carry it. This wasn't mere ritual, it was a fusion of steel and spirit, a belief that earthly skill alone couldn't guarantee victory, only heavenly favor could tip the scales. The inscriptions etched into blades tell a silent story of this devotion. Along a sword's fuller, the groove running down its length, you might find Latin phrases like "in hoc signo vinces," "in this sign you shall conquer," or tiny crosses painstakingly engraved near the hilt. These markings weren't decorations, they were armor for the soul. Some smiths went further, embedding relics into sword pommels, fragments of saints' bones or scraps of sacred cloth, transforming weapons into holy objects. Imagine a knight gripping such a sword, believing his cause wasn't just righteous but sanctified, that every swing carried the weight of divine will. Religious orders like the Knights Templar took this symbiosis to another level. Their workshops functioned almost like monasteries of metal, where blacksmiths worked under vows of silence, treating each weapon as an instrument of God's justice. The Templars' legendary squires of the forge weren't just laborers, they were spiritual warriors, their hammers striking in time with the rhythms of daily prayer. Even the act of plunging red-hot steel into liquid, was seen as a metaphor, the fiery trial of battle, followed by the cool embrace of salvation. But the connection between faith and forging ran deeper than symbolism. Many workshops followed strict religious calendars, halting production on Sundays or feast days, no matter how urgent the demand. Some smiths fasted before crafting weapons for high-ranking clergy, believing purity of body mirrored purity of craftsmanship. In an age where people saw God's hand in everything from harvests to disease, it made perfect sense that weapons, too, required heavenly endorsement. A blessed sword wasn't just sharper, it was holier, and therefore, in the minds of warriors, unstoppable. This spiritual dimension also shaped workshop ethics. Guild rules often prohibited crafting weapons for known sinners or those engaged in unjust wars. A famous case in 12th century France saw a master smith refuse an order from a vengeful noble, declaring, "My steel serves only the righteous." Such principles weren't just posturing, they reflected a genuine belief that weapons bore moral responsibility. Even the materials carried spiritual weight. Iron from church lands was considered inherently purer, while water from sacred springs was prized for quenching, imbuing blades with celestial strength. The irony, of course, was that these same workshops supplied instruments of bloodshed, but in the medieval mind there was no contradiction. War could be both brutal and blessed, a necessary path to divine order. The smiths who straddled this line understood their dual role. They were craftsmen of both earth and heaven, their anvils ringing with the sound of earthly conflict and the echo of something far greater. The same workshops that armed Crusader knights also fueled a shadow economy of blades and armor stretching far beyond holy war. While many imagined these weapons flowing solely to Christian armies, the reality was far more complex and lucrative. A masterfully crafted sword from Damascus or Toledo wasn't just a tool of war. It was a status symbol coveted by emirs, mercenaries, and even wealthy collectors who'd never set foot on a battlefield. Workshops quickly learned that selling to the highest bidder could mean the difference between thriving and shuttering their doors. A single shipment of finely tempered blades to a Sicilian noble might fund months of production for the front lines. But this trade wasn't without risk. Every weapon sold carried the potential of eventually facing its creators on the opposite side of a shield wall. The Mediterranean became a bustling marketplace for these deadly exports. Venetian merchants, masters of navigating political gray zones, acted as middlemen, brokering deals between Christian workshops and Muslim buyers under the guise of cultural exchange. Some even developed coded ledgers, listing swords as agricultural tools or helmets as ceremonial basins to bypass trade restrictions. The ports of Acre and Tyre turned into hubs where Frankish smiths discreetly negotiated with Armenian traders, who then funneled weapons eastward to Georgian kingdoms or south to Egyptian sultans. This wasn't outright betrayal. Many of these transactions were tacitly approved by Crusader leaders desperate to fund their campaigns. When Richard the Lionheart needed gold to pay his troops during the Third Crusade, historians suggest he authorized the sale of surplus arms to Byzantine allies, who then diverted some to Seljuk Turks. The line between ally and adversary blurred with every transaction. Workshop masters became reluctant diplomats, learning to read shifting political winds as keenly as they judged the color of heated steel. A smith in Antioch might refuse an order from a Kurdish warlord 1 month, then discreetly supply him the next when that same warlord allied with Crusaders against a greater threat. Some developed intricate vetting systems, requiring sworn oaths that weapons wouldn't be resold to specific enemies, though these promises often melted away like wax under a merchant seal. The most cunning workshops employed agents to track their products' journeys, sometimes buying back their own blades from battlefield loot to be reforged and resold. It was a macabre form of recycling, where weapons might change hands multiple times before finally being lost to rust or ruin. The ethical dilemmas were as heated as the forges themselves. Church authorities periodically thundered against selling arms to infidels, threatening excommunication, while local lords turned blind eyes to trades that lined their coffers. Some workshops found compromise by altering designs for different markets, shipping swords without cross-shaped hilts to Muslim buyers, or crafting distinct blade markings to avoid embarrassing recognitions on the battlefield. Others embraced pragmatism. A surviving letter from a 12th century armorer in Tripoli shrugs, "Gold has no religion, and neither does good steel." What's often overlooked is how this trade accelerated technological exchange. A Damascus smith might acquire a Crusader mace, marvel at its counterbalanced design, and incorporate similar principles into his own work. Armenian armorers blended Byzantine and Seljuk techniques after studying captured gear from both sides. The famed Turin-Milan style of armor, with its intricate embossing, actually emerged from Christian workshops supplying elite Mamluk officers. War bred strange bedfellows, and the weapons trade became an unlikely bridge between cultures that officially despised one another. The legacy of this commerce lingers in museums worldwide, where ceremonial blades bear inscriptions in both Arabic and Latin, and helmets display hybrid designs no pure Crusader or Saracen workshop would claim. These artifacts whisper a truth the chroniclers often ignored, that the workshops fueling holy war were also quietly stitching together a connected world, one carefully negotiated shipment at a time. In the end, their greatest creation wasn't any single weapon. It was the reluctant understanding that even in conflict, commerce finds a way. By the late 13th century, the once booming workshops that armed the Crusades faced an uncertain future. The fervor for holy war had dimmed, kingdoms shifted priorities, and the constant demand for swords and siege engines dwindled like embers cooling in a forge. Some workshops clung to life by pivoting to peacetime trades, turning armorers into locksmiths, sword makers into tool forgers. The clang of hammers didn't cease entirely, but the rhythm changed, no longer driven by the urgent drumbeat of war. In cities like Damascus and Acre, where the ring of steel had once been the soundtrack of daily life, foundries began producing plowshares, hinges, and horseshoes. The shift was practical, but for masters who'd spent lifetimes perfecting the art of war, it felt like the slow fading of an era, yet the decline wasn't uniform. A handful of elite workshops survived by catering to nobility, crafting ceremonial weapons and ornate armor for tournaments rather than battlefields. These pieces were no less masterful gilded longswords with intricate engravings, jousting helms adorned with crests, but their purpose had transformed. War was becoming a spectacle, and the blacksmith's role evolved from supplying survival to enabling pageantry. Meanwhile, guilds scrambled to preserve their trade secrets, compiling handwritten manuals to pass down techniques that apprentices no longer learned through daily practice. The famed Mappi Clavicula, a medieval metallurgical guide, hints at this transition, blending weapon-making instructions with recipes for church bells and stained glass. The real tragedy wasn't just the loss of workshops, it was the erosion of specialized knowledge. A master smith who could temper a sword to slice through chainmail might spend his final years mending farm tools, his expertise gradually diluted. The subtle alchemy of quenching liquids, the precise fold count for Damascus-style blades, the art of laminating steel for unbreakable edges, these nuances faded with each retiring craftsman. Some techniques vanished entirely, rediscovered centuries later by modern metallurgists puzzling over the superiority of surviving Crusader weapons. Ironically, the workshop's demise was hastened by the very innovations they'd pioneered. As gunpowder weapons gained prominence, the painstaking craftsmanship of a hand-forged sword seemed increasingly archaic. Why spend months perfecting a blade when a musket could be mass-produced in days? The shift marked more than technological progress, it signaled a cultural turning point. Warfare was becoming impersonal, and the intimate relationship between maker and warrior, forged over generations, dissolved into the smoke of cannon fire. But the legacy of these workshops refused to die entirely. Their influence seeped into unexpected corners. Renaissance armorers borrowed their methods, colonial blacksmiths replicated their designs, and even today, traditional bladesmiths study Crusader-era weapons for insights modern industry can't replicate. The workshops may have vanished, but their fingerprints linger on the curve of a parade saber, in the weight distribution of a replica longsword, even in the metallurgical principles that shape aircraft alloys. Their true end wasn't extinction, it was transformation, as the fires of war gave way to the slower, steadier burn of progress. Beneath layers of dirt and time, archaeologists have uncovered the ghostly echoes of these workshops, charred hearths filled with centuries-old slag, shattered molds still bearing the imprints of long-vanished blades, and the skeletal remains of forges where fires burned day and night. Each excavation peels back another page of history, revealing not just how these weapons were made, but the human stories behind them. In the ruins of a Frankish outpost near Acre, researchers found a cache of half-finished arrowheads, abandoned mid-production when the fortress fell. Nearby, a blacksmith's hammer lay beside an anvil, as if its owner had stepped away moments before disaster struck. These aren't just artifacts, they're frozen moments of urgency, telling tales of workshops operating on the razor's edge of war. Some of the most revealing discoveries come from the workshop's waste, the rejects and failures that medieval craftsmen tossed aside. Piles of cracked blades and warped armor plates, though deemed unworthy for battle, are now treasures to historians. They reveal the rigorous standards these artisans upheld. A sword with even a minor flaw in its tempering was discarded rather than risk a warrior's life. At a site in Antioch, archaeologists uncovered a trench filled with thousands of misshapen rivets, each one a testament to the relentless pursuit of perfection. These mistakes speak louder than the pristine weapons in museums. They show the trial and error behind what eventually became legendary craftsmanship. One of the most extraordinary finds was in Tyre, where a flooded basement preserved tools untouched for 800 years. Leather aprons stiffened by time, tongs still clamped around a rusted length of iron, even a wooden workbench grooved by countless hours of grinding. These objects offer an intimate glimpse into the daily rhythms of the workshop. Here, science meets serendipity. Corrosion patterns on anvils help modern metallurgists reconstruct the temperatures medieval forges achieved, while traces of pollen in sediment layers reveal what season the workshop was busiest. Even the soil tells stories. High concentrations of metal particles in certain areas map out where grinding stations stood or where quenching troughs once steamed. But perhaps the most poignant discoveries are the personal ones, the small, overlooked items that remind us these were workplaces filled with people, not just machines. A child's shoe buried near a forge suggests families lived and toiled together. A chess piece carved from bone found wedged between floorboards hints at rare moments of rest. In Cyprus, a workshop's rubble yielded a ceramic mug with fingerprints still visible in the clay, a silent handshake across centuries. These fragments humanize the anonymous artisans, transforming them from vague historical figures into individuals with hopes, frustrations, and lives beyond the anvil. Technology has revolutionized what these sites can teach us. X-ray fluorescent scanners analyze blade compositions without damaging them, revealing trade routes through trace elements in the metal. Three-dimensional modeling reconstructs entire workshops from post-hole patterns and scorch marks, letting us virtually walk through spaces lost to time. At Montfort Castle, laser scans detected the faint outline of a water wheel-powered trip hammer, proof that some workshops harnessed natural energy long before the Industrial Revolution. Each innovation peels back another layer, showing these workshops weren't just functional spaces but hubs of ingenuity that adapted to their environments with remarkable sophistication. The true value of these discoveries lies in how they rewrite history. For decades, scholars assumed Crusader weapons were crude compared to their Middle Eastern counterparts. But archaeology tells a different story. Workshops in the Levant produced steel that rivaled Damascus in quality, blending techniques from across the Mediterranean. A sword excavated at Kerak Castle, its blade etched with Arabic script but its hilt unmistakably Frankish, embodies this cultural cross-pollination. These finds challenge old narratives, revealing a world where craftsmanship transcended borders and where the best workshops were those that learned from everyone, friend or foe. Every shard of slag, every rusted tool, is a puzzle piece in understanding how these workshops shaped and were shaped by the age of the Crusades. They remind us that history isn't just written in chronicles or battles, but in the quiet persistence of daily labor, where fire and skill turned raw earth into instruments that changed the world. And as long as trowels scrape against buried ruins, their stories are far from over. Modern blacksmiths crouch over glowing forges, their hammers rising and falling in rhythms unchanged for centuries except now. Cameras document every step, and thermal gauges measure temperatures. Medieval craftsmen judged by eye alone. These aren't just hobbyists, they're historians with calloused hands, part of a growing movement to reconstruct Crusader-era weapons using only period-accurate tools and techniques. Their work bridges past and present, transforming scholarly theories into tangible steel. When a blade fresh from the anvil slices cleanly through a rope or withstands a brutal impact test, it's more than impressive craftsmanship, it's validation of how advanced medieval workshops truly were. One of the most revealing projects involved recreating a 12th century arming sword from a fragment found in a cracked des Chevaliers excavation. Master smiths began by smelting iron ore in a clay bloomery furnace, a days-long process that produced a spongy mass of metal riddled with impurities, just as Crusader workshops would have faced. Hammering this bloom into usable steel required 16 hours of relentless folding and welding, each strike driving out slag and homogenizing the metal structure. The resulting blade, when polished, revealed swirling grain patterns identical to those on surviving originals, proof that what some historians dismissed as decorative was actually the hallmark of meticulous purification. These reconstructions shatter persistent myths about medieval technology. The notion that Crusader swords were heavy, clumsy implements collapses when a replica longsword balances perfectly at the crossguard, its tapered design making it faster to wield than many modern fencing foils. Another experiment tested the legendary sharpness of Damascus-style blades by replicating the layered steel technique. The reconstructed sword effortlessly sliced through a suspended sheep carcass, not just once but repeatedly, its edge remaining intact while a factory-made control blade dulled after 3 strikes. Such demonstrations force us to reconsider everything we assumed about primitive medieval weaponry. Perhaps the most humbling lessons come from failures. A team attempting to forge a Norman-style helm spent weeks struggling with uneven thickness until they rediscovered a forgotten trick, quenching the metal in alternating baths of water and oil to prevent warping. Another group, reconstructing a trebuchet, realized their design was inaccurate only after watching the machine's counterweight slam into its own frame, a mistake medieval engineers likely avoided through hard-won experience. These stumbles aren't setbacks, they're windows into the trial and error brilliance of ancient workshops, revealing how centuries of accumulated knowledge were baked into every successful design. Beyond proving historical accuracy, these projects resurrect intangible skills. A blacksmith in Regensburg discovered that certain hammering techniques produced nearly identical acoustic signatures to those recorded in medieval guild manuals, a sort of metallic fingerprint confirming authentic craftsmanship. Elsewhere, a metalsmith working with reconstructed bellows found her arms aching after just 30 minutes, a visceral reminder of the physical toll medieval artisans endured during 12-hour forging sessions. Such visceral experiences blur the line between experiment and time travel, letting modern practitioners feel, quite literally, the weight of history in their muscles. The implications ripple outward. Museums now use reconstructions to test display conditions, learning that even climate-controlled cases can't prevent microscopic corrosion patterns matching those on original artifacts. Forensic historians analyze blade angles to reinterpret combat manuals, realizing some ceremonial techniques were brutally effective with properly balanced weapons. Even modern metallurgists study these handmade steels, seeking insights for developing new alloys where flexibility and hardness must coexist. In resurrecting ancient methods, we're not just peering backward, we're reclaiming forgotten wisdom that still holds value today. Yet for all their precision, these projects can't fully replicate one element: the urgency of the original workshops. A modern smith crafting a sword over 6 months faces no consequence beyond a missed deadline, while a Crusader-era master knew his blades might mean life or death for hundreds. This missing pressure, the weight of true necessity, may be the final, unbridgeable gap between then and now. Still, every reconstructed weapon that rings true against an anvil carries echoes of those vanished workshops, reminding us that genius isn't confined by era, and that the past's secrets still have edges sharp enough to cut through modern assumptions. The techniques honed in Crusader workshops didn't vanish with the last holy war. They rippled through centuries, reshaping how nations armed themselves for conflict. Take the Renaissance armories of Milan and Nuremberg, where the echoes of medieval craftsmanship were unmistakable. The same layered steel techniques that gave Crusader swords their resilience reappeared in the swept-hilt rapiers of 16th-century duelists, their blades still folded and tempered with painstaking precision. Even the guild systems that once regulated quality in Antioch and Acre found new life in the great arms factories of Europe, where master stamps on breastplates and halberds guaranteed their worth just as they had on the battlefields of the Levant. This wasn't just continuity, it was evolution, with each generation building on the foundations laid by those ancient forges. Perhaps the most enduring innovation was the Crusader approach to mass production. The workshops supplying Richard the Lionheart's armies had perfected a balance between volume and craftsmanship, creating standardized yet high-quality arms at unprecedented scales. Centuries later, this philosophy resurfaced in the Venetian arsenal, where ships and weapons were produced with interchangeable parts, a concept that would later fuel the Industrial Revolution. The assembly line methods seen in Crusader siege workshops, where specialists focused on specific components like arrowheads or shield bosses, prefigured the division of labor that would define modern manufacturing. Even today, the tolerances and quality checks pioneered by medieval smiths are mirrored in aerospace and automotive industries, where a single flawed component can spell disaster. The materials science emerging from these workshops also left a profound mark. The quest for superior steel didn't end with the Crusades. It migrated to Spain's Toledo factories, where bladesmiths blended Moorish and Frankish techniques to create rapiers renowned across Europe. Later, during the Napoleonic Wars, the Damascus steel pattern so prized by Crusaders inspired experiments in laminated gun barrels, attempting to replicate that legendary durability for firearms. Modern metallurgists still study surviving Crusader weapons, marveling at how artisans without spectrometers or carbon assays achieved alloys that rival contemporary high-performance steels. But the true legacy lies beyond technology, it's in the mindset. The Crusader workshops were among the first to treat arms production as both science and art, where empirical testing mattered as much as tradition. This ethos fueled advancements from the precision firearms of the American Revolution to the modular weapon systems of modern special forces. Every time a soldier today checks their gear for a manufacturer's mark or relies on a standardized cartridge, they're benefiting from systems refined in those smoke-filled medieval forges. The workshops may have crumbled to dust, but their genius, the relentless pursuit of perfection under pressure, still echoes wherever metal meets resolve. Hollywood loves to show medieval blacksmiths as burly men randomly hammering red-hot metal until voila, a sword appears, but the truth is far more fascinating. Those dramatic movie forgers get almost everything wrong, from the chaotic workspaces to the idea that one person single-handedly crafted every part of a weapon. Real Crusader workshops operated with precision that would put some modern factories to shame. Take the myth of the lone blacksmith. In reality, these were collaborative hubs where specialists handled each step, from smelting ore to stitching scabbards. A single sword might pass through a dozen skilled hands before reaching a knight's grip, each artisan adding their expertise like links in a well-forged chain. Another persistent falsehood is that medieval weapons were heavy, clumsy implements. You've probably seen actors straining to lift authentic broadswords, but surviving examples tell a different story. A typical Crusader arming sword weighed between 2.5 to 3.5 pounds lighter than a modern baseball bat, with balance points engineered for swift, controlled strikes. Replicas have demonstrated how a properly balanced longsword can change direction mid-swing with the flick of a wrist, debunking the idea that knights relied on brute strength alone. Even full suits of armor were surprisingly mobile. Tests with accurate reproductions show wearers could sprint, roll, and mount horses unassisted, their articulated plates moving like a second skin. The most damaging misconception that these workshops were technologically stagnant. Films rarely show the innovations bubbling in these so-called Dark Age forges, water-powered trip hammers pounding metal with mechanical consistency, or the use of temperature-controlled clay furnaces to achieve precise heats. Some workshops even employed early assembly line principles, with stations dedicated solely to grinding edges or riveting mail rings. When archaeologists uncovered a 12th century workshop in Tyre, they found evidence of standardized measurements, iron calipers, and templates ensuring every sword guard fit its designated blade perfectly. This wasn't guesswork, it was proto-industrial quality control. Perhaps no myth is more ironic than the belief that Crusader weapons were inferior to their Middle Eastern counterparts. While Damascus steel rightly earned its fame, Frankish workshops quickly adapted, blending techniques from Byzantine and Islamic armories to create hybrid masterpieces. A stunning example is the christened Saracen sword-type blades forged in Crusader lands but bearing woot steel patterns inspired by Muslim designs, then etched with Latin inscriptions. These weren't crude knockoffs, they represented the cutting edge of metallurgical diplomacy, where enemies exchanged ideas even as they crossed swords. The real disservice of these myths isn't just historical inaccuracy, it's how they obscure the ingenuity of ordinary people. Behind every legendary sword was a guild artisan who spent decades perfecting the angle of a quenching bath, or an apprentice who discovered that adding ground seashells to polishing paste gave edges unmatched sharpness. These workshops weren't just making weapons, they were advancing material science, logistics, and even international trade networks. When we reduce their work to simplistic clichés, we erase the true marvel that with little more than fire, iron, and relentless curiosity, they built the tools that shaped empires. In dusty workshops from rural England to bustling American cities, a quiet revolution is unfolding, one hammer strike at a time. A small but passionate coder of modern blacksmiths has taken up the mantle of medieval craftsmanship, not as hobbyists but as guardians of near-forgotten arts. These artisans aren't just making replicas, they're resurrecting techniques so precise that holding their finished blades feels like touching history itself. At the heart of this movement is a simple but profound truth. Without hands-on preservation, skills honed over centuries could vanish within a generation. Take the painstaking process of forging a Crusader-style sword using only period-accurate tools. Master smiths like Hector Cole in the UK start by smelting iron ore in a clay bloomery furnace, just as 12th century workshops did. The process is grueling, days of shoveling charcoal, nights of monitoring temperatures by the color of flames alone. There are no digital pyrometers here, only the same intuitive knowledge medieval smiths relied on. When the bloom emerges, it's not the gleaming steel we imagine, but a porous mass riddled with impurities. Watching Cole fold and hammer this stubborn material for 16 hours straight reveals why industrial methods replaced these techniques. The labor is backbreaking, the margin for error razor-thin. Yet the resulting blade, with its swirling grain patterns and spring-like resilience, proves why these methods endured for centuries. Beyond individual craftsmanship, organizations like the Association for Renaissance and Medieval Swordsmanship host immersive workshops where participants experience the full production cycle, from grinding charcoal to final polishing. These events aren't theatrical reenactments, they're hands-on classrooms where novices learn to read the subtleties of heated metal, recognizing the exact moment when steel transitions from cherry red to sunrise yellow for optimal forging. The goal isn't nostalgia, but transmission, ensuring that if modern technology vanished tomorrow, these skills could still thrive. Perhaps the most vital work happens in collaboration with archaeologists and metallurgists. When the British Museum needed to authenticate a newly discovered Crusader dagger, they turned to blacksmiths trained in medieval methods. By replicating the blade's unique grain structure and quenching marks, these modern craftsmen confirmed its age and origin in ways carbon dating alone couldn't. Similarly, experiments at Denmark's Middelaldercentret have debunked myths about medieval armor's weight and mobility. Volunteers wearing accurately reconstructed mail hauberks demonstrate maneuvers ranging from cartwheels to mounted archery, proving that what looks cumbersome in films was actually engineered for battlefield agility. The digital age has unexpectedly fueled this revival. YouTube channels like Todd's Workshop and Scalagram dissect historical weapons with equal parts reverence and scientific rigor, reaching millions who might never set foot in a museum. One viral video showing a replicated longsword slicing through ballistic gel with terrifying efficiency sparked global interest in medieval metallurgy. Meanwhile, 3D scanning allows smiths to study priceless artifacts without handling them, revealing internal flaws or forging patterns invisible to the naked eye. Yet the movement faces sobering challenges. Mastering these skills demands years of full-time dedication, a luxury in an era where handmade swords compete with factory-produced replicas priced at a fraction of the cost. Some techniques, like the exact quenching liquids used to create Damascus steel's legendary edge retention, remain partially lost despite decades of research. And with few formal apprenticeships left, much knowledge still passes through fragile chains of individual mentorships. What keeps these keepers of flame burning? For many, it's the thrill of solving historical puzzles with fire and steel. When a blade tempered in walnut oil survives impact tests that shatter modern alloys, it's not just a triumph of craftsmanship, it's a conversation across time. Others speak of responsibility, as one German smith told me while etching Carolingian runes onto a freshly forged blade. We're not just making weapons. We're safeguarding choices, every hammer stroke, every heat treatment that some anonymous artisan 800 years ago discovered through trial and error. If we forget their solutions, we might waste centuries rediscovering them. This living heritage reminds us that history isn't confined to textbooks or glass cases. It breathes in the shimmer of a properly folded blade, the satisfying click of a riveted mail ring, the collective gasp when a demonstration sword cleaves a watermelon with surgical precision. The true value of preserving these skills lies not in recreating the past, but in understanding the ingenuity that shaped our present, one meticulously forged link at a time. Imagine standing before the glowing forge, the heat pressing against your skin as you survey rows of hammers, tongs, and raw steel waiting to be transformed. If you could step into the shoes of a Crusader-era craftsman, what masterpiece would you bring to life? Would you reach for the elegance of a knightly longsword, its blade whispering through the air with lethal grace? Or perhaps you'd shape the brutal simplicity of a war hammer, its weight designed to crumple armor with every swing. The choice isn't just about personal preference, it's a window into the challenges and artistry of medieval warfare. Picture crafting a Crusader's arming sword, the most iconic weapon of the age. Every curve of the blade would need purpose, the slight taper toward the point for precision thrusts, the fuller groove along its length to lighten the steel without sacrificing strength. You'd face decisions medieval smiths wrestled with daily. How thick should the crossguard be to deflect enemy blows? Should the pommel be rounded for comfort or angular to double as a crushing tool? Even the grips wrapping leather, wire, or wood could mean the difference between a weapon that feels like an extension of the hand and one that slips in the heat of battle. Or maybe your imagination leans toward defense, a kite shield emblazoned with a cross, its wooden core layered with rawhide and iron reinforcements. Constructing one would demand more than carpentry. It's an exercise in physics. Too heavy and the knight wielding it would exhaust himself. Too thin, and a single axe stroke could splinter it to kindling. The curvature had to be just enough to deflect arrows, the strap placement perfectly balanced for quick pivots. And let's not forget the artistry, painting heraldic symbols with pigments mixed to withstand rain, mud, and blood. For those drawn to ingenuity, the crossbow might spark fascination. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a mechanical marvel, combining the blacksmith's skill with the precision of a clockmaker. Carving the wooden stock was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in the steel prod spring, loaded and capable of storing immense energy. Tempering it wrong could result in catastrophic failure, the metal snapping like a dried twig under tension. Then came the trigger mechanism, tiny yet sturdy enough to hold until the perfect moment. Crafting one successfully would feel less like forging and more like conducting an orchestra of disparate materials into lethal harmony. Then there are the unsung heroes of the workshop, the humble yet vital creations that rarely get glory. Arrowheads, for instance, might seem simple until you consider the variations. Broadheads for tearing flesh, bodkins for punching through mail, even specialized designs for hunting versus siege volleys. Or consider the unassuming spear, the backbone of every medieval army. A well-made spearhead could be more versatile than the fanciest sword, equally effective for thrusting, slashing, or even throwing when desperation demanded it. In the hands of a skilled craftsman, even simple tools became instruments of devastating efficiency. So what calls to you? The weight of responsibility in forging a knight's primary weapon, or the subtle brilliance of perfecting an everyday item that thousands would rely on? Would you chase the prestige of creating a lord's ceremonial dagger, etched with silver and gems, or the gritty satisfaction of mass-producing rugged spearheads for peasant levies? The beauty of these workshops was their diversity. Every role, from the master smith to the apprentice stoking the coals, contributed to something greater than themselves. Now it's your turn. Drop your dream project in the comments. Are you team sword, shield, or something unexpected? Maybe you've got a wild idea for a hybrid weapon that never made the history books. Whatever it is, let's keep the spirit of those ancient workshops alive by sharing, debating, and marveling at the endless creativity that fire and metal can inspire. After all, the next great innovation might start with a single spark of imagination, just like it did 8 centuries ago. The workshops that armed the Crusaders were more than just factories. They were living, breathing crucibles where fire, skill, and necessity fused to reshape the medieval world. Step back and consider the sheer magnitude of their impact. These unassuming buildings, often little more than timber and stone, became the silent architects of empires. Every sword tempered, every helmet shaped, every arrowhead forged carried within it the hopes of kings, the desperation of soldiers, and the ingenuity of craftsmen whose names history forgot. This was no assembly line churning out identical tools. Each weapon bore the fingerprints of its maker, the subtle variations that turned steel into an extension of the warrior's will. What made these workshops extraordinary wasn't just their output, it was their ability to adapt under crushing pressure. When supply chains snapped during sieges, they scavenged broken weapons to reforge. When new enemies introduced unfamiliar armor, they reinvented blade geometries overnight. They weren't just responding to the demands of war, they were anticipating them, pushing metallurgy and design further with each generation. The crossbow's evolution tells this story perfectly. What began as a simple wooden prod became a steel spring marvel capable of piercing chainmail at 100 paces, all because workshops refused to accept the limits of their materials. Yet the true heart of these places lay not in the weapons they produced, but in the people who made them. Picture the master smith squinting at the color of molten steel, his instincts honed over decades telling him the exact second to strike. The apprentice grinding edges by candlelight, hands blistered but determined to prove his worth. The women weaving mail rings with precision that would shame modern machines, their contributions often erased from records but vital to the workshop's survival. Together, they formed a tapestry of skill and resilience, each thread essential to the whole. Their legacy lingers in ways we rarely notice. Modern engineers still study medieval sword tapers for insights into stress distribution. The guild system they pioneered laid groundwork for today's trade unions and quality certifications. Even the humble workshop layout, with its careful zoning of hot forges and cool finishing areas, mirrors the efficiency of contemporary factories. But perhaps their greatest gift was proving that innovation thrives under constraint, that necessity doesn't just breed invention, it refines it to its purest form. As the fires of the Crusades dimmed, these workshops didn't vanish, they transformed. The same hands that shaped weapons began crafting the tools of peace, plowshares, locks, and the intricate ironwork of cathedrals. The skills honed in war became the foundation of peacetime prosperity, a reminder that even the darkest chapters of history can forge light. So the next time you see a medieval sword in a museum, don't just admire its edge, look for the story beneath the steel. The countless hours of trial and error, the silent collaborations across languages and faiths, the unbroken chain of knowledge passed from master to apprentice. These workshops remind us that history isn't just made on battlefields, but in the quiet corners where ordinary people achieve extraordinary things. If this journey into the past has sparked your curiosity, let us know what fascinates you most. Was it the alchemy of steel, the unsung heroes of the workshop, or the surprising connections to our modern world? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden corners. Until next time, keep looking beyond the surface. You never know what forgotten brilliance